Next on Book TV, Trevor Aronson says that since 9/11, the FBI has built up a network of over 15,000 informants in Muslim communities around the U.S. He argues that these informants spearhead phony terror plots, which are then exposed by the FBI with great fanfare to make it look like the Bureau is doing a good job of keeping us safe. Mr. Aronson is joined in conversation by Monica Bauerlein, co-editor of Mother Jones magazine. This is an Hour 15.
Thank you, and thank you so much, all of you, for coming out on a rainy night. Trevor and I spent a lot of time together working on this project, and it's fantastic to see it come into full bloom in this book. I assume that you will all be walking out with a copy, but in case you haven't fully digested it coming in, I'd like to draw Trevor out a little bit on how this came about, because this is a man who spent more than a year of his life on Freedom of Information Act documents from the FBI, and so you might wonder what would possess you to do that. How did this come about? How did you start going down this rabbit hole?
So it actually started for me in 2006. I was a reporter in Miami, and there was a case that was announced involving 7 men from Liberty City, which is a poor section of Miami. And at first it seemed just initially to me a bizarre plot. Alberto Gonzalez came out to announce the case and said that these 7 men were here to declare ground war on the United States of America, and we're going to bomb the Sears Tower and the Miami Beach office, or the FBI office in North Miami Beach. Well, obviously, the question was like, how do 7 guys declare ground war on the United States of America? It was just ridiculous. And then I realized that there was an informant involved. Early on, it was clear that these men didn't have a connection to Al-Qaeda, that the connection was an undercover FBI informant who was posing as an Al-Qaeda operative, and that was their only connection to terrorism at all. And so I did my stories when I was in Miami, and I kind of put that in my back pocket. And over time, I realized that there were more and more cases being announced, and they all had this similar pattern. That was that the people charged with terrorism were involved in these fantastical plots to bomb subway stations, to bomb downtown office buildings, but they never had the means on their own. They never had the ability to acquire weapons. And those weapons were provided by either an undercover agent or an FBI informant posing as an Al-Qaeda operative or an affiliate of a terrorist organization of some sort. And so right around 2010, I began to question, well, how can we figure out how many of these cases have existed since 9/11? How many of the hundreds of terrorism prosecutions since 9/11 were involving real terrorists who are serious, imminent danger, and those involving people that had no capacity for terrorism on their own, but for an informant or an undercover agent providing them with the means? And so I had applied for, every year, Lowell Bergman at the Investigative Reporting Program hosts 3 journalists to pursue a project that could take a year or more. And I pitched to him doing something that took a holistic look at all of the terrorism cases that had come to U.S. courts since 9/11 and figure out how many of them involved a terrorist and how many of them involved people I would later term dupes that had no capacity for terrorism on their own but for that FBI informant. And so, working with Monica, we ultimately produced a story that looked at that entirely. And what we found is that of more than 500 terrorism prosecutions, 1 of every 2 involved an informant. Sometimes the informant did what you'd expect. He provided information. But in the cases of more than 150 defendants, the informant either played a part in the plot or, as in the case of 50 or more than 50, played the role of an agent provocateur, where he provided the means and the opportunity for people who on their own never had that capacity. And I think what's important about that, and what's the underlying part of the findings, is that we can show these dozens of men who never had capacity on their own for terrorism, but the ones who did have capacity are actually very few. Najib al-Azazi, who came close to bombing the New York subway system, Faisal Shahzad, who came close to bombing Times Square. These were dangerous terrorists, but as I mentioned in the book, you can really count on one hand the number of people who actually posed a serious threat. And then the others are people like the Liberty City 7, this case in Portland going to trial right now involving a man named Mohammed. They never had capacity on their own. They never had the ability to acquire weapons, but the FBI provided them with all of the means they needed to go from being these men on the fringes to essentially dangerous terrorists overnight.
So take us inside one of these cases, if you would, because the stories you tell in the book are really quite astonishing.
One of my favorite cases, many of the cases are very complicated, so it's hard to tell them quickly, but one of my favorite cases to tell in a situation like this is about a man in Illinois named Derek Sharif. And according to the documents, we don't know exactly why the FBI targeted him, but the FBI decided that he was a potential terrorist threat, and they assigned an informant to go talk to him. And at the time, Derek had recently converted to Islam, had been ostracized by his family for it, and was working in a video game store and had no place to live. Just the day before the informant came in, actually his car had broken down. And the informant goes into the video game store and strikes up conversation with him. It's just before Ramadan, and during that conversation, Derek tells a sad story to this informant, and the informant says, well, you could come live with me, and I've got a car you can use, you can eat my food. And Derek, being religious, says, well, this must be the work of God, and sure, I'd love to go do that. And over the course of several months, they talk about Islam, and the informant encourages him to get involved, to take action for the terrible things that the U.S. government is doing to Muslims around the world. And Derek then says, kind of in his brash way, well, I want to smoke a judge, I want to kill a judge. And Derek didn't know the names of any judges, but he still said that. And the informant then says, well, what about if we attack the shopping mall? And Derek excitedly says, yeah, I want to go attack a shopping mall. And he's getting very excited about it. And at that point, the FBI has essentially a sting in place. But the major problem the FBI had in this sting was that Derek didn't have any money. And the FBI needed an overt action. They had to have more than just talking. So they needed him to acquire weapons. And the informant says to him, well, I know an arms dealer who can sell you grenades. And I know you don't have any money, but you've got these old stereo speakers. And I think if you took these stereo speakers to the arms dealer, he'd take them and just say, trade, here's the grenades. And I don't know much about black market arms, but I'm pretty sure no arms dealer is going to take stereo speakers for grenades. So Derek then dutifully goes to the shopping mall. And in the parking lot of the shopping mall is the arms dealer, and of course it's an undercover FBI agent. And Derek brings over his old stereo speakers and hands them over, and the agent then hands over the 5 grenades that are actually inert. And other agents rush in and arrest him and charge him with conspiracy to conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, and he's serving 25 years in prison. And what's revelatory to me about that is that obviously this is a man who isn't a danger to himself, or if anything is a danger to himself, isn't a danger to other people as a terrorist. But during the sting operation, he actually said to the informant at one point, if it wasn't for you, I probably would have just ended up stabbing someone with a steak knife. And that illustrates his capacity. He was capable of a minor crime at best, yet through this elaborate sting operation, we were able to, the government was able to go to the public and say, here it is, another terrorist caught, another plot foiled.
So something you did, because you're a journalist, not an historian, as it were, is that you were able to talk to actual people and find out what they were thinking in this process. And you especially really made an effort to get a sense of why the FBI would be doing this and what the rationale is from the Bureau's point of view.
Right. There are a few people who've worked in the FBI who are critical of this, but in general, of this program, but generally what you find among FBI agents, current and former, is a general support of this program. And in the FBI's view, what they believe is that Al-Qaeda, as it existed on 9/11, isn't as it exists today. That there isn't the capacity for a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda to send from overseas a cell of people who will commit a horrific crime. And instead, they're concerned about what they term lone wolves, which are people already here in the West who are disaffected, disillusioned, have bad feelings about the United States, want to go do something, and that they will then watch an Al-Qaeda video, a jihadi video, and that will inspire them to act, and then they will launch an attack of some sort. And what the FBI refers to this as is Al-Qaeda-ism instead of Al-Qaeda, that Al-Qaeda moved to this franchise model, unable to create terrorists of its own. It would kind of infect them with this idea, and then they would go carry out this attack. And so what the FBI is specifically looking for are people who are on this spectrum that the FBI terms, on one side is operational, and then on the other side is a sympathizer. So what they want to do is find someone who's on that line on the sympathizer side that's just about to cross over to operational, to become a terrorist, and catch him before he becomes a terrorist. And these sting operations are intended to draw them out, to find the people interested in committing some sort of act of violence, and arrest them through the only means the FBI has, which is the criminal justice system, prosecuting them according to some sort of law, which in this case would be conspiracy to use weapon of mass destruction or other terrorism-related cases. But through these sting operations, identify them first. And I think it's easy to be empathetic to the FBI's view, and I try to talk about this in the book, which is that if you're a case agent and you have this guy on tape and he's saying, I want to bomb that building, or I want to bomb the subway system, you probably don't want to be the guy who says, yeah, let's just ignore him and he'll mature out of it, and then 6 months later he actually does commit an act of terrorism. And so I think that's easy to understand that, why the FBI would pursue these kind of types of cases. But what I put out in the book is that there has yet to be an example of someone who on their own is incapable of terrorism, someone who's a loudmouth, someone who doesn't have any weapons, who on a chance meeting meets an actual Al-Qaeda operative and says, hey, here's a bomb. The only people providing the capacity is actually the FBI. And these sting operations are kind of an evolution of drug stings, where you've seen where in the movies that's been glamorized, where a guy's got an empty briefcase and two people believe there's cocaine inside and they hand over money, and then they hand over the empty briefcase, the person opens it, it's empty, and they rush in and they arrest the person. Well, a sting like that works in a sense because data clearly shows that if they're not buying or selling drugs from the FBI in a sting operation, they can buy and sell it somewhere else in the United States. Drugs are not difficult to obtain in the United States. But what is difficult to obtain is actually the weapons that people would use in a terrorist operation, like a large bomb, for example. And there has yet to be that case where we have someone who on his own is a sympathizer, crosses over to operator, and wants to commit an act of terrorism, and somebody actually gives him the means. That just hasn't happened to date.
Is this something that's fairly unanimously supported within the FBI, or is there controversy, is there dispute among people who work on this kind of stuff?
There is controversy inside. A lot of these operations have kind of bled over from after 9/11. George W. Bush said, never again. We don't want another terrorist attack, and allowed for a greater marrying of ideas between the CIA and the FBI, where there had always been a lot of tension. And there are people inside the Bureau who believe these types of activities, specifically the types of activities that involve aggressive recruitment of informants in Muslim communities, data mining in Muslim communities, is what they would term going to the dark side, moving in a direction that the CIA generally had gone into. And so while I think in general there's general support among FBI agents for these policies because these are the types of cases they work, there is a minority inside the FBI that is very critical of these cases. Getting them to talk is a difficult part. Part of the book and part of the Mother Jones story, we had occasions where we had to use anonymous sourcing. But there are people who, such as Michael German or James Weddick, former agents, who are very openly critical of these types of programs and do not believe in their efficacy.
You've also gotten some criticism since the book came out, including today in a review in the Wall Street Journal, from people who are saying, no, you've got this all wrong. This is pretty much what law enforcement has to do in order to prevent another 9/11.
Right. So today, Ali Soufan, a former FBI agent, wrote a very critical review of the book in Wall Street Journal. And what his criticism really hinges on is what a lot of the FBI's criticism I've heard hinges on, including John Miller, the former assistant director of the FBI. And when they criticize the work, they consistently talk about real terrorists. They mention Faisal Shahzad, who came close to bombing Times Square. They mention the shoe bomber. And they mention Jose Padilla, the so-called dirty bomber, as examples of, you've got this wrong, there are really terrorists out there. And I'm not disputing the fact that there are terrorists. I'm not disputing the fact that Jose Padilla was potentially dangerous. I'm not disputing the fact that someone like Najibullah Zazi came very close to bombing the New York subway system. But where I think they go wrong in using those examples is that these are examples of cases and people and terrorists that never came on the FBI's radar through sting operations. They were not the target of sting operations. And in fact, in some ways, I think they prove my point that what you have real terrorists out there, but ultimately these sting operations have proven impossible for the FBI to tease out real lone wolf terrorists, to tease out the real people who are dangerous. And instead, we're drawing into sting operations the kind of dupes, the people on the margins of society. And many times these are people who are economically desperate. In some cases, they're mentally ill. For example, there was a case recently in Seattle involving a man who had schizoaffective disorder, which means he had trouble distinguishing between reality and fantasy, making him very susceptible to the hard will of an informant. And I think in the book, I tried to draw a line as much as possible between these real terrorists, and there have been real cases of terrorism in the United States since 9/11, with these other cases. And I think where the criticism I'm getting from the FBI right now is that they kind of mix the two, and they don't make that distinction.
The informants themselves are really interesting characters, and there's that old saying that you can't, you're not really going to be dealing with Boy Scouts when you're trying to bust bad guys. But these are, a lot of them have a lot at stake in these cases, financially and often criminal cases involving them. How does that color what happens here? Right.
So I think the story I told to Mother Jones and the story of the book is as much a story about terrorism as it is about the fairness and administration of justice in the United States. And the informants really get at the heart of that, which is that the informants that the FBI uses in these terrorism sting operations are not guys that are necessarily in it because they want to keep America safe and it's a great place to live. They're in it for other reasons. You know, you can make upwards of $100,000 on a case, you know, if you bring in someone who you can prosecute for terrorism. So the informants have a direct financial incentive to find terrorists. In other cases, the FBI uses coercive methods to recruit informants. You know, for example, generally speaking, in the Muslim community, Muslims in the United States, it's a law-abiding, affluent community. You're not going to find a lot of people committing crimes. And so the normal mechanism for recruiting informants, such as we had in organized crime, where you get someone on a lower level offense and flip them, isn't really that useful in Muslim communities. But immigration is, because it's a largely immigrant population. Most Muslims in the United States have immigrated since 1990. So if they're here as immigrants, or if they're citizens, they may have family that they're trying to get over. Many Muslims are vulnerable on immigration status for the FBI to use as a method of recruitment, to say, hey, unless you work with us, you know, we can make your life hard. We could potentially deport you. And in those cases, their incentive is they want to stay in the country. They want to get their family here. And they'd have an incentive, while not financial, another type of incentive in trying to find terrorists. And these informants, under this pressure, under the financial incentive or under the pressure of the threat of deportation, can't really go out into the community and say, hey, I looked around, I didn't find any terrorists. Their job is to find terrorists, right? So they find people who are more susceptible to their suggestions, so to speak.
And the FBI also has a lot at stake. I mean, it's one of the things that I found quite revelatory in working on the story with you is understanding really how much the Bureau has become transformed by counterterrorism from this organization of accountants and, you know, people chasing very different kinds of crimes to now the majority of its budget going to counterterrorism.
Right. So yeah, before 9/11, the FBI was an organization of lawyers and accountants, and they pursued organized crime, but they also pursued mortgage fraud, financial fraud, and they weren't necessarily terrorism first and foremost.
Maybe we missed out on something along the way somewhere.
That's a good question. Yeah. So, you know, in our focus on terrorism in the last decade, you know, if you haven't noticed, we've missed out on a lot of financial fraud and crime. And whether the FBI being more focused on that would have made a difference is a hard thing to determine. But what we can say is that the FBI has a financial incentive and a financial pressure to build cases, to build terrorism cases, because Congress allocates the FBI's budget, and every year now they allocate $3 billion, which is the largest portion of its budget. And the FBI really can't spend $3 billion, just like the informants can't take the money and not find terrorists. The FBI can't spend $3 billion and go back to Congress and say, hey, we looked around, we didn't find any terrorists with your money. Instead, the FBI is able to use these sting operations as a very effective mechanism to justify how it spent its money and justify further spending on terrorism. And you know, the FBI has been very public in touting these cases. If you read FBI Director Robert Mueller's testimony over the last few years, when he talks about counterterrorism, he rarely talks about someone like Najibullah Zazi who posed a real and direct threat. He's more likely to talk about someone like James Cromedy, who was a man in outside New York City who was a Walmart stalker, had a history of mental problems. An informant targeted him and got him involved in a plot to bomb synagogues in the Bronx. Well, those bombs were provided by the FBI. The informant offered James Cromedy $250,000 to move forward in the plot. There was no indication that James Cromedy on his own could have become a terrorist. In fact, at one point the FBI was a little worried his case would fall apart, and they told the informant to give James Cromedy $300 and ask him to buy a gun, because their fear was that if the sting fell apart, if they had a gun charge on him, because James Cromedy was a felon and couldn't have a gun, they could at least bring something. And so the informant gives him $300 and says, hey, go buy a gun. And James Cromedy spends the whole night in and around New York City searching to buy a gun, and comes back the next day.
He had no idea how.
He had no idea how. And he comes back the next day and gives back the money.
How about Walmart?
Right. Even at Walmart, you could buy guns where he worked, and he wasn't able to get a gun. And what I think is so incredible about that case is this is a man that Robert Mueller goes before Congress and says, this was a dangerous terrorist. But it's also a man that we can say had $300 in his pocket and couldn't buy a gun. Like, how dangerous could this man really have been I think we all know that guns are not that hard to get in the United States, and he was unable to. And yet this is a man that the FBI director portrays as a dangerous terrorist that their counterterrorism operation was able to foil.
Did you see any evidence of this kind of approach leaking from counterterrorism, or from specifically going after alleged Muslim Islamist terrorists to other communities? Yeah,
you see this significantly in More so among left-wing activists. Particularly, there's a group that was recently charged with trying to bomb a bridge over the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. This was a group of so-called anarchists. They had no capacity on their own for a crime, but an informant provided them everything they needed to move forward in a bombing plot. There was a similar case in Chicago during the last NATO summit. And so we are seeing this, but what we're really not seeing it on is on the right-wing side. We're not really seeing this type of tactic used, for example, against sovereign citizens, against white supremacists. And I don't know the reason for that fully. I mean, I think this is kind of an internal bias within the FBI. For example, the sovereign citizen movement, which is this movement that I would consider right-wing, but not everyone does. But it's a group of people who believe that they can opt out of US laws, that the US law is basically a contract. You can opt out of the contract and you're not susceptible to US laws anymore. And they have a very paranoid belief that then, every time law enforcement arrests them for, say they didn't, get their license plate renewed because they thought that was a contract they could opt out on, that this was like paranoia, or in their paranoid belief, this was the government persecuting them. And so what ultimately happens is they stockpile weapons. And we've had, law enforcement killed by sovereign citizens. And only since 2009 has the FBI even acknowledged that sovereign citizens are really a threat. And I think what's happened is in kind of the FBI's focus on counterterrorism, they focus specifically on Muslim communities and then branch that out a little bit into environmental activists, so-called anarchists, but we haven't really seen it focused on the other side. And I think the argument can be made that sovereign citizens and white supremacist groups and white-ring domestic terrorists are just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than any of these other groups.
You'll be really interested in this data project we're working on at the moment. But,
okay, that sounds great.
It's got a little ways to go yet. There are the obvious implications for this kind of publicity to these kinds of cases, furthering the notion that essentially in every Muslim community lurks jihadist terrorism. Has that been raised, and is that something that people in counterterrorism think about as potentially damaging, in that it doesn't recruit people to want to help identify the few people who might actually be dangerous?
Right. So there is this idea of a blowback effect, right? So the FBI is focused so specifically on Muslim communities that they've used thousands of informants to recruit other informants. And if you talk to religious leaders in Muslim communities, they'll often say a joke, yeah, when I pray, I assume the guy next to me is an informant. Well, that has an effect, right? I mean, this creates a very damaging effect on the relationship between Muslim communities and law enforcement. And especially when the fear is that by going to law enforcement, a Muslim is putting himself at risk of being recruited as an informant himself. And so what we've seen is a cutting off of that relationship, so that flow of information. So it's less likely today than it was before 9/11 that a Muslim in the United States would see something suspicious and call the FBI. And I think that has a very damaging effect on law enforcement, because I think if you talk to any cop, they would say the best tips come from people who live in that community, right? They have a vested interest in the community. Their business is there, their family's there, they worship there. But because of this cutting off of information through the FBI's very aggressive stance in Muslim communities, they've limited the amount of information they get and the flow of information they get to the informants that they pay. And then these informants in turn have an incentive to provide information to say, hey, there's a terrorist here. We believe this man is suspected of being part of terrorism, and then they create a sting operation. But I think, so the question is then, like, is it possible we will miss cases? Is it possible that there really will be a terrorist in the United States? He will be trying to hide among an active Muslim community in the United States, perhaps worship at a mosque, and that Muslims would say, this guy looks really suspicious, and then fear that they would not want to provide that information to law enforcement. I mean, what we do know anecdotally is that the FBI inserted an informant into a mosque in Orange County, California, and he talked very boldly about how he wanted to commit terrorism, and he was trying to recruit people to be a part of it. And what we do know is that actually the Muslim community turned him in, but they didn't go themselves to the FBI. They went to CARE, and CARE then the Council on American Islamic Relations, and then CARE provided that information to the FBI. So I think this is something that's really difficult to measure, but I think it's the blowback effect that is the most concerning. What are we missing as a result of not having a good relationship with Muslim communities in the United States?
which has been an asset, right? I mean, there's an interesting comparison there to Muslim communities in Europe that have been much more alienated in some cases from law enforcement in those countries.
Right. I think obviously the Muslim communities in the United States were far better integrated into our society than I think than in Europe. And there was a Pew study that was done of immigrant groups, and what it found was that among immigrant groups, Muslims had the highest likelihood to want to become citizens, to want to fully integrate into the community, to become very Americanized, so to speak, than almost every other group. And it also, there's also, if you look at demographic studies, Muslims in the United States are very affluent compared to most other immigrant groups. And so it's highly unlikely that, a guy, in my view, a guy in worshiping in Orange County who drives a BMW that his parents purchased for him is likely to be the person who's going to become a terrorist. He's living a great life in the United States. And I think that's very different from what we see in Europe, where there's been, in many cases, there's been almost a ghettoization of the Muslim communities in Europe. And that hasn't been the case here at all.
There is some, it's hard to draw an exact parallel, but there is some overlap with the debate over torture, where you have a similar argument that the end justifies the means, that, in order to prevent these really horrible acts, basically you have to do some bad things. And that's obviously been very much at the forefront again with Zero Dark 30. Do you see any parallels? Do your sources see any parallels? And do they talk about that?
It's not necessarily parallels with torture, but it parallels with you kind of have to do what you have to do, right? The idea of using informants, the term that the FBI uses is, well, if you're going to catch the devil, you have to go to hell. So, but the problem is that they assume by necessity that the devil is in these Muslim communities, even though really evidence showing that that isn't the case. That the people they're able to draw in as terrorists ultimately are these people on the fringes of society who on their own aren't capable of terrorism. But I think what it's justified, this fear of terrorism in the United States, has justified all sorts of measures by the government that I don't think most Americans, if they fully knew about, would condone. For example, there's a huge data mining project. The FBI terms it domain management, where they use and bring in as much data as they can to predict where problems are in a community. And for the most part, what domain management allows for is racial and ethnic targeting. And so basically they can say, well, we believe there's a concern about Pakistanis living in the DC suburbs, and they can pull up a map using domain management and figure out exactly where Pakistanis live in Virginia in the DC suburbs, and then assign informants accordingly. And I asked an FBI agent about this, about how this was, why you did this and why it worked. And the analogy he used was about a murder investigation. And so what he described to me was, you hear you get a tip that there's a dead body on this farm, and you don't know where it is, but we've got to find it because it's part of our investigation. And one of the agents says, we should get a helicopter and look from above and try to spot it. And then the other person says, we should walk every inch of this farm, piece by piece until we find the body. And then the third person says, no, we don't have to do any of that. If you look above, you'll see birds circling, and the body has to be under there, right? Well, I mean, that makes sense. And he applied that to domain management. But the problem with that analogy in domain management is it assumes that the threat of terrorism necessarily exists in Muslim communities. So you can, so he's comparing the domain management to being the bird circling around and saying, here are the Pakistanis living in the DC suburbs. But that requires the FBI to have a belief that terrorism exists in that community, when I think the evidence really suggests that that isn't the case. But that's the type of thing that, in the fear of terrorism, we are allowing a number of programs that I think would concern people if they fully understood what was going on.
There's an interesting parallel there to maybe what happened prior to 9/11, when law enforcement was essentially fighting the last war and was looking for terrorism where they thought it would be, and not really being open to signs of where it might occur.
You mean as far as Iraq and choosing Iraq as a...
Well, that too. Separate discussion. But it seems that law enforcement is very often, possibly by necessity, I mean, maybe to some extent we all do this, looks at, this is the kind of person who has committed crimes in the past, therefore this is the kind of person we need to look to for future crimes, when in fact crime evolves.
Right. And One good addition I have on that is that, I talked to a former FBI agent named Myron Fuller, and Myron Fuller's job was he was based in Southeast Asia, and his job was to look for connections between Islamic terrorist groups in Asia and Southeast Asia and Central Asia, and how they were connected to groups in the United States. And he said the FBI prior to 9/11 invested tons of money to try to figure this out. Are there connections between these Islamic terror groups overseas and Muslim communities here? Are they financing them? Are they harboring them in any way? And all of these efforts came up empty. They had no connection whatsoever. And after the '93 World Trade Center bombing, they doubled those efforts to make sure, well, did we miss anything? And Myron says, we looked, we didn't find any terrorists. We didn't find any connections to terrorists. Muslim communities weren't connected in any way to these groups overseas. And in his view, what happened after 9/11 was that they had all of this information to believe that Muslim communities in the United States weren't supporting terrorism, weren't harboring terrorists, but they threw all that out. In kind of the shock and awe of 9/11, they thought, well, there must be a connection, right? Like Muhammad Atta was living in Hollywood, Florida. That must mean there was some Muslim community that was supporting him and protecting him. And so what they did is they had information to suggest that wasn't the case, but they just chose to assume that all of it was wrong after 9/11. And in many ways, the policies we're seeing that the FBI use now are based on that, this suspicion that because the group of terrorists that attacked us on 9/11 were Muslim, they were integrated into communities in the United States, then there must be others here. And really, that just doesn't seem to be the case.
That's also something that seems to play out when these cases go to court. I mean, it's quite, it's not just, the FBI assembling these cases and running the informants and putting them together. Then they go to court. And I believe, at least at the time that we published the story, you found that not one terrorism charge that had actually come to a jury has ever, not one of those defendants has ever been found not guilty. Right. They don't even bother to plead, if I recall.
Yeah, there's a very high degree of guilty plea. There are a few anomalies. There were 2 defendants in the Liberty City 7 case that ultimately got off, and one of them got off despite the evidence being very similar to the other defendants, and we don't fully know why that happened. And with those 2 outliers aside, what we have is a near perfect record of conviction in these terrorism cases. And in my view, where this becomes less a story about terrorism and more a story about justice is that through these sting operations, the FBI is able to take someone who isn't capable on his own of terrorism and bring him along and engage him and get him involved in a plot, for example, to bomb a subway system and use a so-called weapon of mass destruction. And because he uses that weapon in this plot, he's then subjected, if he goes to trial, to mandatory minimum sentences that are designed for people who really have the ability to get that weapon. And so if he goes to trial, loses, which odds are that he will lose, ultimately he's going to face 25 to 35 years in prison. And most of these men are in their early 20s, sometimes in their 30s, with near perfect records of conviction. Most choose to plead down and they get 12, 13 years in prison. But in all of these cases, they are subjected to minimum sentencing guidelines for crimes that they had no capacity to commit on their own, but the FBI then engages them in a plot and provides them with the weapon that ultimately qualifies them for this harsh sentence that Congress designed for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and real terrorists, but ultimately it draws in people, like this guy in Portland, Mohammed, who had no capacity for his own for terrorism, said he wanted to bomb a courthouse square in Portland, and then the FBI provided him everything he would need, the van he needed, the bomb he needed, even paid his rent because he was about to be evicted and they didn't want his eviction to jeopardize their sting operation. And now he's in court arguing entrapment, and what we know is that he's the 11th defendant to argue entrapment since 9/11, and if he succeeds in getting off on entrapment, he'll be the first, but the odds against him winning on entrapment are low, in part because when you argue entrapment, what the government has to prove is that you were predisposed to commit the crime. And what the government's been very effective at doing since 9/11 in these cases is putting government experts on the stand who say, well, he watched jihadi videos, he was predisposed to commit a crime. I mean, the bar for predisposition has been lowered so greatly in these cases that all the government really needs to prove is that he watched jihadi videos. And to me, that's ridiculous, right? Like, I watch jihadi videos, you've probably seen a jihadi video, and we're not going to commit acts of terrorism. But the government bar for
watched a lot of them in the process of investigating this.
Right. That's right, I watched jihadi videos. And so then, but that ultimately becomes evidence of predisposition in these cases, and that's why winning on entrapment in these cases is so difficult, if not really, if you look at the data, impossible when it comes to terrorism cases after 9/11.
I would like to encourage all of you to get your questioning hat on, because we do have an opportunity to ask questions. I have one more question for Trevor, and this is motivated in part by the fact that there are not one but two Mother Jones fact-checkers in the audience, and I'm going to put them on the spot. Hamid Al-Aziz, who was the fact-checker on this piece that you did for us and did yeoman work in researching this, and Gavin Aronson, who's hiding in the back. And these guys know a lot about what I'm going to ask you about, which is just the mechanics of a project like this. Here you are with this book, and it all looks nice and tidy, but putting this information together involved a little more than calling up the FBI and saying, hey, how about these stings that you run.
Right.
How did that actually work?
Right. Well, don't forget Lauren Ellis, who's an important part of this.
And Lauren,
yeah.
Lauren's here.
So Lauren, who's here, Lauren worked with me at the investigative reporting program for nearly a year, and a big part of this was we wanted to build the most comprehensive database of 9/11 cases that in the decade and make it public. We wanted to look at all these cases and figure out how many involved informants, the role of the informants. Whether the informant's role could be fairly classified as an agent provocateur, that he provided the means, in some cases provided the idea. And the problem with these cases is that the DOJ, when they file them, don't necessarily have a section where it says, yeah, we used an informant and this was his role. You have to read through thousands of pages of records to find that information. And so a big part of that became Lauren and I in Berkeley just going through ECF, going through PACER and the electronic files. In most cases, we could get them online. In others, I had to go to warehouses around the country to pull the court files. And then we systematically reviewed them and tried to classify them as best we could. And Hamid and the other fact checkers at Mother Jones then had the really hard work of cleaning up our data in some cases, fact checking it all. But I think ultimately that was the strength of the Mother Jones project, and I think it's very much the strength of the book, is that when these types of investigations had been done in the past, they'd always been anecdotal. Someone had drawn a comparison to one case and another and said, this must mean a trend. But what I really felt strongly about is that the only way to really prove this is a problem is to show it through the data. And what we could show with specific numbers were how many were involved in sting operations, how many of those sting operations involved agent provocateurs. We could trace informants from case to case. In some cases, there was one informant who was accused of murder in Pakistan and then became an informant and then later worked on several cases. And we could trace all of those lines through these cases. And I think that's what really made this powerful. And I think that's where, and this was a great example, I think, of collaborative journalism, right? This was a project that started at the University of California, Berkeley's investigative reporting program. They funded it to begin with. And then we joined up with Mother Jones about 5 or 6 months in, and then you helped us, create the data, make it interactive, provide the fact-checking resources, give it the publicity and the support it needed. So we had two different organizations, working on a single project in the end.
Well, in case any of you don't know, but likely you all do, the investigative reporting program is run by Lowell Bergman, who is probably best known as the guy who was portrayed by Al Pacino in The Insider, the former 60 Minutes producer who blew the tobacco industry wide open and documented how they had been hiding what they knew about the effects of tobacco. So when Trevor came to Lowell with this story, there was a twinkle in Lowell's eye because he knows a few people in the FBI. And
right, and and Lowell was critical. One of my biggest stumbling blocks was not necessarily having the time to do the project, although that was one concern. But it was just you couldn't do this project without access to the FBI, right? It ultimately wouldn't have the impact we would want because the FBI could say, well, why didn't you talk to us, and we could tell you what's going on in the back. So in researching this project, there were really two sides of it. There was the data side and the record side, where we tried to build this database and we looked at every case in as detailed a process as we could. And then the other side was taking all of that data and taking those stories and then going back to the FBI and saying, explain to me, how did this guy get targeted? Why did you choose to target someone like this? Did you really fear for him? Tell me about the program that calls for these types of sting operations. And through those two things, I think we were able to put together a relatively complete picture of the program, the types of cases it brought, and really what the FBI's fears and motivations are in pursuing these cases. I don't necessarily think the FBI is here. There's someone at the top of the FBI saying, oh, we really want to stick it to Muslim communities and trump up charges. But I think this is really a bureaucratic problem. You have all this money and they need to build cases. And so ultimately what we have is a program that in trying to capture terrorists before they strike end up sweeping in people that really on their own didn't have the capacity to become terrorists. And likely, in my view, the evidence suggests probably never would have become terrorists on their own.
It really sounds like a case of bad incentives all around.
All around, yeah. I mean,
especially the poor schmuck who, wants an apartment and wants some housing and wants to feel, grandiose and like he's going to smoke somebody, and the informant who has money on the line, and the FBI that has, line items and budgets and a reputation on the line.
Right, and case agents, if you're a case agent in counterterrorism, you're measured by the results you bring in, right? Well, so if you're a case agent on counterterrorism, you don't bust any terrorists, you're not a very good case agent. So they're then putting pressure on their informants to bring in people, and I think that creates this really toxic recipe where we have people brought into sting operations, prosecuted as terrorists that, really, if you look closely at the case, there's really little argument to be made that they really could have become terrorists on their own.
So let's hear from the audience, and this is being filmed, so give the mic a chance to come to you, please, in the back.
Thank you. There's a lot of people who don't believe the official story of 9/11, and I think one reason for that is how the FBI handled so-called 9/11 suspects before 9/11. And it sounds like it was a little bit the opposite of what you've been saying, how they were so avid after 9/11 to find anybody who was even remotely a suspect of terrorism, whereas before 9/11, I think there's documented evidence that they were even told to ignore or kill certain investigations they had on potential 9/11 suspects. Have you studied any of that?
This really isn't the focus of my research or the book. I mean, I know there's a lot of theories about 9/11. I mean, what I focus on is really the changes that happened in the FBI after 9/11 and what we've seen these terrorism sting operations become, the type of people they target. So I really don't feel comfortable talking about a lot of that.
I think what you do say in the book and in the piece is that the impetus to never let this happen again under their watch, especially to never be blamed again, was a big part of the motivation.
I think this was really, what I make the case for is that this was, what we were seeing now is really an overreaction to the FBI being caught completely flat-footed on 9/11. They really underestimated the threat of Islamic terrorism. There were agents in the FBI who were waving flags saying Al-Qaeda is a real threat, and the top-level management really wasn't interested in hearing that prior to 9/11. And then 9/11 happens, and we have this huge shift within the FBI where terrorism, which was once not a high priority, suddenly becomes the top priority. And these programs have kind of been born from that very rapid shift, which happened overnight. As soon as 9/11 happened, the FBI became a very different agency.
I want to encourage the fact checkers, among others, to make Trevor sweat a little bit, because you guys know you guys know where all the bodies are buried.
Hi there, my name is Nick. I'm just curious. Can you hear me? I'm just curious if the target ever calls the FBI and says, hey, this guy's a terrorist offering me money, and tries to bust the informant. And do they ever have,
That did
happen. Yeah, I mentioned that briefly. There's a really great case in Orange County that became a real black eye for the FBI involving an informant named Craig Monte, and they had reason to. There was a man in Orange County that the FBI believed was tangentially connected to Osama bin Laden. Craig Monte's job was to really draw him out, and so Craig Monte, made a number of over-the-top statements about how we should get involved in a terrorist plot. And it was actually the FBI that, it was actually the members of the Muslim community that called the FBI and said, hey, there's this guy named Farik al-Aziz, what was his cover name, who we think he's a terrorist. And the funny part of it was that when the way it's been described to me is that the representative from CARE called the FBI and said, hey, I think we've got a terrorist. And the FBI was very eager and said, oh, who? Give us a name. And they say Farik al-Aziz. And the FBI agent was like, oh, well, don't worry about him. And because of that quick shift, the Muslim community in Orange County was like, oh, that guy's an informant. And, and then it just blew the whole case. But that is a great example of, going against the FBI's logic in the sense that, here was someone that the Muslim community in Orange County suspected was a terrorist, and actually it was they who turned him in.
And also the guy who Googled Shahed Hussein.
Right. So my Mother Jones story focuses largely on an informant named Shahed Hussein who had worked in a couple of cases. And Shahed Hussein, to the middle of last year, moved to Pittsburgh. Many of these informants will move from city to city. And so my story focused on Shahed Hussein. And then there were a number of documents that we had posted online, including, FBI transcripts. One of those FBI transcripts that we posted online included Shahed Hussein's phone number. And so Shahed Hussein then moved on to another case in Pittsburgh and was pursuing another man. And he gives the man his business card. And he says, are you interested in fighting with the brothers? And the man became very concerned about him and does what probably every one of us does and Googles his name and doesn't find anything. And then decides to Google his phone number. And he Googles his phone number and it brings up the document we posted online. He finds the name and he then Googles it and finds the Mother Jones article with the informant's picture. And he's like, well, I've got an informant. But the amazing thing about that is that the FBI, with all of its resources, didn't even bother to change the phone number of the informant from case to case. So that was another example of a plot that was foiled. In that case, actually, they did end up charging the man with a crime, but it was based on a YouTube video of him firing a weapon at a gun range. And the problem with that was that he was a felon and he shouldn't have been in possession of a gun. The video was a year old. He didn't even have the weapon. It wasn't his. But they weren't able to get terrorism charges on him, but they ultimately used him for that. Whether they're still using Shahed Hussein or not, I'm not sure, but I believe they likely are. He's one of their most prolific informants.
Maybe the NRA would have helped him out, though, if that case had worked.
Hi, Trevor. I wanted to ask you about other countries and whether this type of approach, do you know, is used in other countries, or do they have a different way of looking out for potential terrorists? Because I've heard that it's quite different in other countries, and I just wondered if you knew anything about that.
I'm not an expert in this area, but I do know that obviously they can't use sting operations in Europe. Europe has very strong entrapment laws, and this would be rather unheard of for them to create a type of sting operation like they have here. Whether in the United States, it's not just terrorism stings, but it can drug stings, gun stings. That type of case doesn't happen. At least in Europe, and I've not heard of it happening in other countries, but I don't want to say that for sure. This is the only, you never, obviously, terrorism is as much a concern in Great Britain as it is here, right? But you never see, British police using these types of tactics. They have other tactics that they use to try to prevent terrorism, but they don't use sting operations specifically.
I heard just sort of like people talking about it, that in England they would, if they suspected, they would just go over and talk to them and say, we think you might be terrorists, so we're going to keep an eye on you. And then they do.
The lawyers in these cases, that's the defense lawyers, that is one thing they say, which is that you spent all this money concocting this terrorism sting with my defendant, and he was a young, impressionable guy. If you would have just scared him and then maybe counseled him and said, what are you doing? That we wouldn't have had to go through all of this. I don't know if that is true, but that is what the defense attorneys say. And if you look at some of the people that they bring, like I mentioned, Derek Sharif, the guy with the stereo speakers, that's someone that the FBI probably could have just scared, and it's unlikely that he would have continued forward in any terrorism plot later. And it's certainly unlikely that he would have ever had the economic resources to acquire a sophisticated weapon of some kind. So I think that is the interesting idea. The other part I would mention of this is that the FBI says this is a real danger and that these are people that would strike if they weren't there to prevent it. But if you look at the last 10 years since 9/11, there have been more people killed by lone gunmen, like this guy in Connecticut, than there have been by people who have been sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. So that either means that the FBI is flawless, that they get everyone off the street that would ever want to commit a crime, which seems highly unlikely, or that the threat that Islamic terrorism and lone wolves pose is not what the FBI has sold it to the American public. There's a question over here.
So, oops, where's the turn on? Is it on? Oh, it doesn't sound like it on this side. Well, this is starting to sound like what they're doing in drugs. What was the thing that just came out in a movie about the Central Park? That they pressure them into, they entrap them, pressure them into false confessions and send them off for 50 years or whatever. And it seems to still be a pretty healthy industry. Can you just sort of comment on, is this the same old thing, or?
I think the parallel is the bureaucratic problem, right? Like the FBI and the DEA received tons of money to fight drugs, and they had to produce results. And so sting operations provide a very effective way for them to do that. They can use this and say, we've caught this drug dealer, we brought this many cases. And terrorism has the same effect, that they get $3 billion and they have to show something for it. And sting operations are a very effective mechanism for them to do that. So it's not like the FBI learned a new trick in this type of operation. They basically just adapted an older one.
So I think we should just tell them to give us our money back, and that would solve the problem, don't you think?
Yeah, you have to talk to your congressman about that. I mean, that's where Congress's role comes in deciding what the FBI's budget is, and then that budget then dictates the priorities of the FBI's investigations.
Hi, I think you've done a really good service to highlight the lousy job that the FBI has done. However, I think to totally denigrate the fact that Al-Qaeda is an implacable enemy of all of us here, and that attacks happened, terrible post 9/11 attacks happened in Madrid, where I had relatives, and in London, I think is foolhardy. So while the FBI should do a better job, I think it's foolish to totally, poo-poo that they should be doing something. They should be doing something. So I guess they should be doing it smarter.
Yeah,
wouldn't you
I
agree?
agree with you. I don't mean to make the case, and I don't make the case in the book that Islamic terrorism isn't a threat, that there aren't terrorists, and that there haven't been terrible attacks since 9/11. I mean, obviously there have been. What I make the case for is that most of the terrorism cases that we brought to court since 9/11 haven't been like the Madrid bombing. This was a group of people that were able to carry out a horrific attack. But we're not seeing that in the terrorism prosecutions we're ultimately bringing. Instead, they're so fearful of these lone wolves that they're ultimately bringing in people who on their own aren't capable of that. And there isn't evidence to suggest, like we've seen in Europe, that there are cells of terrorists here who can and are able to commit these horrific attacks. Like, that just hasn't happened. I mean, the most recent case was Faisal Shahzad, who ultimately failed. And the sting operations in that case were unable to tease him out. The FBI wasn't aware of him when he delivered the bomb in Times Square. So while there are terrorists, the question I'm raising is whether these sting operations are ultimately the best way of capturing them. And if by using these sting operations and announcing them to the public as an example of another terror plot foiled, we're essentially exaggerating the threat of Islamic terrorism as it exists within the United States.
Well, and there too, the interesting argument you make in the book is that within law enforcement there is this debate about whether the money would be more effectively spent enlisting communities as a first line of defense.
Right.
Yeah, so as a follow-up, so communities would be one, better approach. And what other suggestions would you have based on your research?
I mean, I think, in my view, what I'd like to see the FBI do is, obviously terrorism is a part of the FBI and should remain a part of the FBI, but I don't necessarily know that the evidence exists and the data exists to support it being the largest part of the FBI's budget. Financial fraud, organized crime, which had been the heart of the FBI's activity prior to 9/11, probably should get more funding than it currently gets. I think the cycle that the FBI is in is that because it receives so much money for counterterrorism, it needs to justify that funding, and these sting operations provide that funding. But at the same time, I should mention that there is an effect of this in defending the FBI's view that we can't fully measure, which is, in the broken windows theory of law enforcement. By using these sting operations, the FBI creates what they term a hostile environment. So if you're here in the United States and you want to commit some sort of act of terrorism, because of these sting operations, you may be really suspicious about talking to the guy next to you because you think, well, he says he wants to work with me on a plot, but maybe he's an undercover agent, maybe he's an informant. And that has an effect that we can't fully measure. And that's one thing that the FBI talks about. But what we aren't seeing are a lot of capable terrorists in the United States. And even when we are, these sting operations ultimately aren't able to tease them out, to find them ahead of time.
Yes, I was just wondering if, as a result of your investigation, if you found that the FBI has changed some of their methods on the relationships they have with the informants, and for it to be maybe less coercive, because usually it seems like, from what you're saying, their social status is kind of one of the means on why they may be easy targets.
So far, the recruitment of informants hasn't changed in any significant way that I know of. There is pending legislation from Stephen Lynch of Massachusetts in Congress that would give greater congressional oversight to how the FBI uses informants and provide greater reporting to Congress on why particular informants were used, the criminal records, whether they were allowed to, in some cases informants are allowed to commit crimes as part of their investigation. There is a movement to create greater oversight with that. But within the FBI, it's still very much, not a lot changes in a quick amount of time within the FBI. So, this investigation over the last couple of years hasn't really resulted in any changes that I've seen in how the FBI recruits informants. I mean, what we're still seeing is that the informants who are used are generally questionably worse than some of the ones they target. You know, for example, in this recent case in Seattle involving this man I mentioned who had schizoaffective disorder, the FBI enlisted a convicted child molester as an informant, and then there's evidence to show that he was sending sexually explicit text messages which were a violation of his parole while he was working for the FBI. And so that's the type of stuff that if Congress were to take greater scrutiny, that would be the type of informant they may look at. But as it is now, the FBI is still using informants who either have a financial motivation or a case of working off a crime or a threat of deportation.
You mentioned entrapment earlier. Is there some different standard for entrapment being applied just because these are terrorism cases? Because it seems to me if you applied the same kind of tactics in the financial industry, you could have half of Wall Street in jail in no time at all. So, I mean,
that may be true. Entrapment isn't an easy thing to win no matter what, right? Because you're required to say, yes, I did it, but my will was overpowered by the government agent, and were it not for him, I wouldn't have done it at all. What works against entrapment in terrorism cases in particular is what I mentioned before about the predisposition. The government has to show that the person who had an interest in committing the crime and exhibited behavior or said things that suggested he wanted to commit the crime before the government agent played a role. So like in a Wall Street crime, they would have to prove that the person wanted to embezzle money or commit some sort of fraud prior to the FBI even getting involved. In these terrorism cases, they have to do the same. They have to establish that they want to commit an act of terrorism. But the bar for predisposition is very low. So all they really need to show in some of these cases is he watched a jihadi video. And the government has so-called experts who come on the stand and will testify that, well, this guy watched one of the Al-Qaeda classics, and when people watch these videos, they self-radicalize, and that means predisposition. Of course, none of that is really supported by any social science. I mean, that just because you watch something doesn't mean that you would become a terrorist, and there isn't any studies to support that. But the government has been very effective in putting on experts. The most notable is a man named Evan Coleman, who then testify that because you watched a jihadi video, you are predisposed to terrorism, and that has made it very difficult. The other difficulty is that in arguing entrapment, you were asking a jury to be sympathetic to you, to say, hey, I wouldn't have done it were it not for being overrun by the informant. And these plots are so horrific. These plots are bombing subway stations. These plots are bombing, office buildings that someone can say, like, I ride the subway, and I work in the office towers, and I think that creates even less. That's a further barrier to sympathy with the jury, and that works against the defendants of terrorism cases even more. But that said, arguing entrapment in any case is very difficult in the United States.
I wanted to ask you if you intersected or got any information about the Cuban Five, because they are definitely, I think, a case of FBI entrapment, and I don't believe there's any evidence that any of them even spoke about committing a terrorist act, but were trying to actually infiltrate right-wing Cuban American groups to prevent terrorist acts. So.
Right. I'm from Florida, so I love the story of the Cuban Five.
Great.
But that wasn't the focus of this specifically. What we were looking at was international terrorism and what the DOJ classified as international terrorism, and they didn't classify the Cuban Five as that, as far as like as they log these kind of cases. So that didn't come. But obviously there's a whole other great story about the use of spies in Cuba. Juan Pablo Roca, for example, and that's a really interesting storyline on its own, but very separate from these types of cases, unfortunately.
Write another book.
He asked 2 questions. I gotta say, I kind of like the analogy that you go where the birds are to find the body. It doesn't seem like that's what they did. They're not going where the birds are flying. They're going somewhere else, looking somewhere else. Where are the birds flying? What is the profile of a terrorist? Is it a fringe person, or where should they be looking?
Well, what we do know is that there are examples of fringe people who get involved in terrorism, right? Like Jose Padilla was a guy who was a social misfit, traveled overseas and got training and came back and was the so-called dirty bomber. But what we haven't seen yet are people within the United States, incapable of terrorism on their own, say they want to commit terrorism, and then become terrorists because they meet an Al-Qaeda operative. But what the government believes is that the profile of a terrorist is a young man, 16 to 35, unmarried. So you're okay. But you know, the reason I criticize the birds analogy is that it requires them to believe that the threat exists where they see the birds flying. So in this case, they see the birds flying over Muslim communities. And so they focus their resources on those Muslim communities. And that's why I think it's not the best analogy that they use, because birds fly over a dead body because, you know, they're vultures and they feed off the dead body. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't fit the same way. You know, for the FBI to use data to ethnically map or religiously map a community and then say we're going to target, you know, Iranians in Los Angeles or wherever, requires them to believe that they have intelligence, or in some cases maybe it's a predisposition to believe that there's terrorism from those communities. It's hard to know. I mean, what we do know is that there was training material inside the FBI that has been very Islamophobic and was used up until 2 years ago. You know, for example, some of this training material described the Prophet Muhammad as a cult leader, that, you know, Muslims raising money for charity was a mechanism for raising money for terrorism. And so that, I think, raises questions about the internal ideas about Islam in the FBI, and whether there's a belief that even when they can't show that there's terrorists from those communities, there's a belief that, well, they're Muslim terrorists come from Muslim countries, or Islamic terrorists, there must be a connection. And that's really where they draw that line. And that's why the bird analogy I don't think necessarily works, but that is the FBI's defense in using domain management to use data to target specific communities.
I'm going to use moderator's privilege and ask a question that is maybe on our minds, you know, having just seen President Obama's second inauguration, and that is, where has the Obama administration been on all of this? You know, a lot of the cases you mentioned are pre-2008. Has anything changed?
Right. So terrorism sting operations were a program developed under George W. Bush, and they have basically continued unabated under President Obama. And I think one of the extraordinary things is that if you look at the 2012 presidential election, you know, one of the areas that Obama was strongest on was national security, right? National security and foreign policy, which are normally like the glass jaw of Democratic candidates. And he was strong on it. And what we've seen is a doubling down almost on these policies. You know, Eric Holder came to San Francisco for a meeting that Muslim advocates put on, and he was questioned specifically about these sting operations. And he insisted that these are a legitimate law enforcement tool for finding terrorists. What we've also seen under Obama, and I think there's been a hesitancy by the press to really be critical of this, has been, you know, an increase of surveillance. You know, the amount of warrantless wiretaps, the amount of warrantless electronic surveillance that we're seeing. You know, the FBI, when it believes that someone might pose a terrorist threat, has 72 hours where it can go through your email, go through your trash, go through any kind of digital remnants you might leave behind, looking for evidence that you may be involved in terrorism. And we've seen an explosion of that. You know, Google reports every year the amount of government requests it's gotten, and that's increased enormously. And what we have seen is a really strong stance by Obama in defending these actions. We've seen a steady increase in the types of cases. And also, if you look at when we were doing the initial Mother Jones investigation, there's been about a year of data since then, and the percentage of informants that are agent provocateurs compared to who provide the means and in some cases the idea is even higher than what we saw before. You know, these are people like the Muhammad case. The most recent one is this case in New York involving a guy named Quasi Nafis who wanted to bomb the New York Federal Reserve. They provided the FBI informants provided all of the means, and we're seeing more and more of that under Obama. And so this has kind of become a policy Obama has stuck to and defended, and I find it hard to believe that anything will change over the next 4 years.
Although there continues to be debate on things like the electronic privacy aspect of it, and certainly General Petraeus was, you know, surprised to find that his Gmail account was not as secure.
I think that's the most extraordinary thing, right? Like, this electronic surveillance, this is a power that took down the CIA director. And so if it takes down the CIA director, you know, by airing his dirty laundry through electronic surveillance, you know, obviously this has the potential to affect so many people.
And while we're on that topic, and this is partly comes to mind because Mother Jones has had some really interesting experiences with undercover recordings, as Mitt Romney well recalls. There's a lot of undercover recording going on in the kinds of cases you describe, and I just wonder, just mechanically, do these informants wear a wire all the time, some of the time? How does that get decided?
Yeah, sorry we didn't bring this up earlier because this is an important aspect, that because informants are so untrustworthy, right? Like I mentioned, the child molester, the accused murderer, they have an incentive to lie. The FBI is supposed to record everything they do so that they don't have to worry about the informant having to go on the stand and say, yes, this is what happened, and not really having much credibility. but they rarely do that. The first encounters between an informant and a terrorism sting target, which are the most critical, at the most critical improving entrapment, the most critical improving predisposition, they are rarely recorded. There was the case in Newburgh that I mentioned of the men plotting to bomb synagogues in the Bronx. 4 months went by and the FBI informant didn't record any of their conversations. But kind of even more, something that's even more concerning, I think, is that there's a really high degree or high chance that the FBI will experience what they term a recorder malfunction. And it always seems to happen on a very important meeting. And so for example, there was a case involving a man in Baltimore who realized he was in a sting operation and calls up the informant and says, hey, what's going on? I don't want to hear any BS. Tell me, is this a sting operation? And the informant says, no, let's talk about it. Why don't you come over? So the guy comes over, and of course, this is an important meeting. What's he going to say to keep him in the plot? And the FBI somehow experiences a recorder malfunction. And so that wasn't recorded. But what we know is that the guy then jumps back in the plot and calls him the next day, which in a conversation that is recorded, and says, hey, I'm ready to move forward. I want to do it. And we see that consistently, and I criticize it in the book because here is a sophisticated law enforcement agency. They should have some really good equipment. They're not exactly buying stuff at Best Buy, and they are having a high degree of recorder malfunction, which to me is very suspicious that in these meetings that seem so important, there's such a high chance that the meeting won't be recorded. And it's actually something they're wrestling with in this trial in Portland right now, where the first meeting between Mohammed, the target of the sting operation, and 2 undercover agents was not recorded, and the FBI's excuse was, well, we ran out of batteries, and that's why they didn't record it, and that's why they logged the recorder malfunction, which again, I think is very suspicious.
Question here and a question back here. Hamid, you haven't had a chance yet, so let's.
I just had a short one. Oh, there. I think with Nixon, he had his secretary that had an automatic thing under the Mary Lou, because they.
Rosemary Wood.
Yeah, because they named a part of the Freedom of Information area after her. So. So.
Hey, Hamad.
I guess my question is, how has the Muslim community reacted to some of the work that you've done on this topic? Have people reached out to you since the Mother Jones article was published and in the midst of your interviews?
Yeah, the response from the Muslim community has been really great. Actually, CARE in New York and the National Lawyers Guild are hosting a talk for me at Columbia next month. I think I've been heartened by the emails I've gotten that they think this is important work, that there's a real benefit to putting out there the fact that this is a community that has been targeted by FBI agents in a very aggressive way. And so in general, I've received a great amount of support. In reporting the story too, this was a difficult story to report because, here I am, a non-Muslim, going into a Muslim community, asking these questions, and the first thing they might think is, well, that guy's probably an informant, right? And fortunately, that wasn't the case in most of these cases, that, the Muslim communities in general have been very open to talking about these issues. And I think that's been very helpful.
The case in Portland that you were talking about, is in the news at the moment, and this guy actually has a pretty interesting backstory. If you can tell us a little bit about, his biography, it illuminates what you're talking about.
Yeah, so this guy Mohammed was kind of a misfit. He lived in Oregon, and what we know when the FBI targeted him initially, we're not quite sure, but he kind of lived 2 lives. He espoused a very conservative form of Islam, and at the same time was kind of a partier. He would go to parties and drink, and there's a.
He was what, 19?
He was 19, and there's a situation where, as people at this party at Oregon State University describe, he went home with a girl and they had sex, and the girl later accused him of date rape because she didn't remember anything. She thought she'd been drugged, and the Oregon State Police initially investigated that, and we're not sure when the FBI became interested, but the FBI then showed up at Oregon State, at the State Police Department, as he's being questioned on this date rape. And he's adamant, no, I didn't rape anyone. I didn't research date rape drugs. And he signs over a form that says, yes, you can search my hard drive, because they were accusing him of having researched date rape drugs. And he signs over the form. He gives them the hard drive. He gives them access to his phone. And it turns out later that the test on the accuser came back that she didn't have any date rape drugs in her system. But what Mohammed didn't know was that as part of that, they turned over to the FBI his entire hard drive. And suddenly Mohammed got an email from a so-called terrorist that said, "Are you still interested in joining the Brothers?" Because there was indication that Mohammed had emailed potential terrorists in Pakistan. And Mohammed says, "Yes, I'm interested in moving forward in this plot." And they say, "Well, why don't you come meet us at this hotel in Portland?" And he agrees to do that. And that was the first encounter, which the FBI was supposed to record and didn't, and they ran out of battery. And during that meeting, according to the FBI, they said to Mohammed, "What would you like to do? Find a plot for us to get involved in." And Mohammed goes away, and he comes back a few days later, and he says, tells the FBI agents about this Christmas tree lighting ceremony in Portland, and thousands of people are there. And the FBI agents say, "Well, there's children there, right? Do you want to kill children?" And he says, "I don't care. Something about the enemies. If they're enemies of Islam, they should die. And I don't care if children and innocent people are blown apart." And that was a big quote that the FBI has put forward. But the problem was that Mohammed on his own had nothing. Like, he was about to be evicted from his apartment. He didn't know how to build a bomb. And the FBI agents then provided everything. They rented a storage unit. They gave him a list of things that he needed to buy. One was a battery, the other was some kind of switch, another was a cell phone, all of which were components to build this remotely detonated bomb. And the FBI then builds the bomb for him, and they built it so to seem so authentic that it smelled like gasoline. And so they put the bomb in the back of a truck and back of a van, and Mohammed had spotted out a parking spot near Pioneer Square, which, as people in Portland tell me, is incredibly hard to get a parking spot during this Christmas tree lighting ceremony. But lo and behold, that parking space is available as Mohammed pulls up in the van, and they park the car, and he walks away, and Mohammed dials up on the cell phone to detonate the bomb, and it doesn't go off, and the guy says, "We'll do it again," and he dials again, and then FBI agents rush in and arrest him. And this was portrayed in the media as this dangerous plot that they had foiled. But later we find out that Mohammed didn't know how to build a bomb. It was the FBI that built it for him. He didn't have any specific connections to terrorism. And he was 19 at the time. He was, a baby for the most part. And at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, in the middle of that sting operation, he was about to be evicted. And the FBI gave him, I think it was $3,000 to pay his rent and his back rent, so that wouldn't become a part of the issue. And then later it's come out, that there was an email from an FBI agent talking about how Mohammed liked to smoke pot and he was kind of a misfit. And the email said something like, "Well, we think he's probably susceptible to our pitch," which was an example of the FBI not looking so much for someone who really was dangerous, but someone they could draw into their sting operation. And right now, they're putting on a very vigorous entrapment defense. Of all the cases I've seen go to trial in these, I think this is the one that stands the best chance of actually winning on an entrapment defense. But even then, as I mentioned, it's probably a difficult road for the defense.
The questioner wants to know about the financial incentives that the FBI provides in these cases.
Right. It's hard to know exactly in the Mohammed case. It's hard to know what there was an informant involved early on, but for the most part, most of the actors were two undercover agents. But there are obviously financial incentives for informants in particular. But it's even to some degree agents, right? Like your performance is based on your caseload and the cases you bring in, and that dictates whether you get a promotion, whether you get a raise. And you could make the argument that there are financial incentives involved in all of these cases to some degree.
Well, I meant with the guys who were allegedly terrorists. $40,000.
Oh, yes, you're right. So she mentioned that there are financial incentives for some of the targets in these cases, and that's absolutely true. For example, the case in Newburgh that I mentioned earlier, the informant had offered $250,000 to them to move forward in the plot. In the Liberty City 7 case in particular, which was the 7 men in Miami, they were expecting a money transfer of $50,000 from what they believed was Al-Qaeda. And the evidence in that case suggested that the lead guy, Narcil Batiste, may have been as interested in just hustling the guy as he was interested in committing some sort of act of terrorism. Most of the transcripts seem to suggest that he was going to say and do anything until that 50 grand wound up in his bank account. And that's ultimately, and of course 50 grand never came, and they got him involved in a terrorism plot. But in that case, they gave an oath to Al-Qaeda. They seemed to move along with whatever the informant wanted. And that evidence suggested that they were financially motivated, that they wanted that money.
We're running out of time, but I think it's safe to say that Trevor will be happy to hang around and talk to you individually. I want to thank you once again for doing this, gigantic project. It's from these kinds of investigations that we learn about the mistakes we might be making and how to do things better. I want to thank all of you for coming out, and if you haven't picked up a copy of Trevor's book yet, now you know why you must, and grab a copy of Mother Jones while you're at it, and support this wonderful venue that's allowed us to be here tonight.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Monica. Monica and Mother Jones was such a huge part of this, so that's why I'm really flattered and honored that you're here for this event, so thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming, and thanks City Lights for this event. I'll stick around. I'd love to meet everyone, so if you have time to talk, I'll be here. Thanks.
Thank you.